We are all a little depraved and debaucherous. Here is the king of podcasts.
And welcome to the Depraved and Debaucherous, King of Podcasts, here with you. Welcome you to another episode of the program, and thank you for listening in here via the courtesy of kingofpodcasts.com. And of course, you can also find the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, on the YouTube channel, and you can find all those links there at kingofpodcasts.com. Just go right to it. But again, thank you. And also just look for the show. Just type it up, look for me there, and feel free to download. And especially Spotify, because it's my personal place to go listen to podcasts, and I do like that platform quite a bit. Especially also for my playlist that I also put together as well. I've put together a couple new ones, so if you want to take a listen to a couple of those, I now have an all-rock version basically from the start of the Beatles up until current day, called the Rock Vault. And then I have a new one called the Big Town Sound, which is very much the urban sound, like the city sound. So that's everything is soul, disco, funk, house, freestyle, the Latin freestyle, dance, very early hip hop. So there's a very vintage classic collection, but very cool in its own way as well. And that's called the Big Town Sound. So take a look at those right now, kingofpodcasts.com. I have it all linked right there for you. In the meantime, let's move along into the continuation of what ended up being the second most listened to episode of Depraved and Debaucherous this year. Only behind, which was, surpassing everything by far, was the psychology of sugar daddy, sugar babies, and sugar dating. That, blew me away in how well that went, but people were really responsive to that. Same thing with sex work solicitation, an overnight Olympic sport in Paris. People really responded to that. And I'm coming back on that again this week because of the fact there were more comments about what happened. I mean, there were actually some comments being made about that particular episode. Not so much of what I was talking too much about, but what it is that other outlets decided to go ahead and pick up on what I was doing, talking about sex work. Because of this story, the spotlight it got for in the Olympics caused other advocacy organizations and other publications to speak out about sex work in different areas. So we're going to talk about those in a moment. I only got one comment about this, and explain to me what this means, but Jeffrey Richardson on YouTube writes, Uncle Leo's Paul, Asian Island 2 eggs raw, Peanuts Mike's macaw. I'm not going to even try to interpret or decode what that is, but that's what he wrote. And it was the one comment I had on there that I could actually go and read on here. Other than that, what else am I going to do? But let's move along and talk about it. So last week on the program, let me go and make sure I clear everybody about that. So we took a story about the recent crackdown on sex work going on during the 2024 Paris Olympics. And as the event's going on right now, it's the second week. It's going to be closing out by the time you might hear this episode. And French authorities have been ramping up efforts to curb prostitution and trafficking, which were surging along with such large-scale international gatherings, which we talked about the Euro soccer event, having that as well, and all these different things. So police intensified documentation checks, targeting undocumented migrants who engage in sex work, driving them into more perilous and clandestine circumstances. So now we're at the point where we know this was going on. Paris has their own setup, and there were a couple of stories that did bring up Paris and referenced it. Another story this week decided to go ahead and go further into it. That's Dazed Digital. They decided to go and talk to some more sex workers. And the story is how the Paris Olympics is impacting sex workers in the city. This was after I recorded my episode. So as we mentioned, French police establishing an anti-pimping brigade in Paris, cracking down on sex work. And as we know, the Nordic model that we talked about last week, that law enforcement is trying to crack down on the Johns and the pimps, and not necessarily the sex workers. If you're talking about in the States, it's more of that. By the way, last week I talked about sex boxes. I forgot that was the other story that I had that was quite popular. Sex boxes in, I think it was Germany or some Czech Republic. It was one of those Eastern European countries that had that going on, that you could just pull to the side of the road at like a bus stop, and you can go inside, and here's a little, spot where you can go and just bang somebody, whatever you want. If you find a sex worker, you want to go somewhere where it's private, you go to one of these sex boxes. Private, and discreet, I guess, and then you can go do your thing, use it, the women have to be licensed to use those sex boxes, to have people to go into those sex boxes, right? It was just interesting to go and say the word sex box for like over and over in the episode, but that's just another thing. Now, so the word was that Paris's quieter streets had been filled with cops. And that was because French authorities were accused of social cleansing, where they were moving away homeless people, migrants, and sex workers, and there was a rise in evictions and heavy-handed policing. So police crackdowns have been on the rise since December 2023, as a matter of fact. So it's been going on longer than this, but of course this is the leading up to the Olympics. Let's try to clean up the town. Now, I guess they can clean up the streets, but they couldn't clean up the river Seine to make it, swimmable for those to go and use that for various events. So what are you going to do, right? So as we talked about, that a large number of sex workers are being put into administrative detention centers issued with OQTS, or Obligation de quitter le territoire français, an obligation to leave the country. So basically being, kicked out, exiled from France. So they were either being put in detention centers and then basically just being deported, even if they might be French. So there were both public parks and famous sex work sites they were talking about. There were the crackdown hotspots in Paris. And one of the areas we talked about last week was that there's a big community of Chinese sex workers. Remember we talked about a 55-year-old, divorced Chinese sex worker who also was dealing with cancer, right? It was amazing. But yes, a Chinese sex worker. And they were talking about the fact that, police have been making it harder, trying harder to scare them by following them into their apartments and denouncing them to the owner. According to the law, the owner, knowing that they are sex workers, would have to evict them. Now, there was an issue where the Nordic model to sex work was being instituted in France as of April 16. And it was where clients and third parties, as opposed to sex workers themselves, are the ones that are being criminalized. The model, which is said to be abolitionist and based on the idea that all sex work is abusive and all sex workers are victims, renting a property to a sex worker can be considered profiting off sex work. As landlords risk prosecution for this, they tend to evict tenants if they find out, or even suspect that they're engaging in sex work. Or as sex worker and activist Thierry Cheffacher tells Dazed, they accept the legal risk, but will make sex workers pay for it through higher rent prices, sometimes twice the market price. Yeah, screw them over. That's not good. But last week, the Nordic model was upheld in France after a legal challenge by 261 sex workers. It was widely criticized because the Nordic model criticized it was hurting sex workers' rights and global human rights organizations, saying that it only serves to increase violence against sex workers by forcing them to engage in riskier behaviors in more remote and subsequently more dangerous places. So the idea is that, the sex workers would rather be able to work together in collaboration and just work in the same place where everybody's familiar with where the sex work is. Okay, that's the part of town. Now, if France is allowing sex work, allowing prostitution, you allow it. So if you are legalizing it, then you basically have to have a way for all these women or all these people here to go and have some place to ply their trade. I mean, you created the rule. If you didn't want it, you don't have it. But you put it here, so you just can't say, okay, we're going to legalize it, and then we're going to push you wherever we want. Or just send you away. Just whenever it's good for them. And who gets penalized, that's one thing, but it's like, they're trying to say it's the part where even advocacy groups are saying that, if there are women or men that are in sex work, that they're not only being trafficked. And that's the part that people need to understand. That there are some women that will definitely vehemently say, again, 261 sex workers going into a legal challenge saying that, they're not being sex trafficked. They're not being abused or violated. This is what they wanted to do. They choose to do this, believe it or not. And it's like that more often than you can imagine. Now, not just in Paris. There is other places where the same thing goes. So we move along and take ourselves to India, where India apparently is looking to unionize. Now, there is an article from livelaw.in. And what they're trying to say here is that the unionization of sex workers in India is highlighted as a potential model for providing support and safety to sex workers globally. And they want to organize labor to help mitigate the risks and abuses faced by sex workers, advocating for similar measures in countries hosting large events like the Olympics. So let's take the story and go delve into it. So what they say about sex work is considered a legal and immoral profession in India, which leads to stigmatization, marginalization, exploitation of sex workers. And despite this, sex workers are entitled to the same legal protections as any other worker, including the right to form trade unions. And the right to form trade unions is considered a fundamental right of workers. So they actually can be able to go and put themselves in unionize. But there's been unions put in place, but that's what they're trying to say, that overall, that all the women should be unionized overall. Now, one of the biggest challenges for sex workers in forming trade unions is the lack of legal recognition for the profession. Since it's not considered legitimate, sex workers don't have any legal standing as workers. So they can't register their trade unions with the government and cannot benefit from legal protections and that other workers employ. The other part is lack of resources and support. Many sex workers operate in the formal sector and work independently, without any support from employees or colleagues, making it difficult for them to come together and form unions. Now, there are some that have come together, and that sex workers are entitled to the same legal protections as any other worker, they say, and the right to form trade unions. So, the thing is that there are some advocacy groups that want to go ahead and legitimize sex work and just legalize the whole point, not just of, I guess, prostitution, but make it where it's like, they can be unionized. They can actually be worked as actual workers with real protections and rights. I mean, do we want that? Do we want them to be taxed? Do we want them to kind of like get like an LLC or whatever to go and do sex work? Is that something that, we're all looking to go ahead and look forward to? Does that sound like a good idea? I don't know. But now a similar issue going on where in France there was the whole petitioning and the legal challenge that was going on about helping to protect sex workers. Well, guess what? It's going on as well in Albany, in the state capital, New York. Now, we talked about that story here about New York possibly legalizing prostitution. That was something that we're going to be trying to do. You might remember they tried to go and pull this off, and we talked about it before, but I don't know how far they got into it, if it did get institutionalized or not. But I never looked back at that to find out or not if it actually did happen. But it's still illegal in New York. It's a Class B misdemeanor, punishable by up to 90 days in jail. So it's much like everywhere else. But there was talk about trying to go ahead and legalizing it. And it was talked about more and more in other areas. But like what I had worked on was back in the New York Post. I actually talked about this in May, and the latest update I could find about this story was that Albany lawmakers are racing to legalize prostitution before the legislative session ends in June. So I guess I never got that far. But the plan was to legalize prostitution and make it so that critics couldn't be able to go ahead and complain in advance. So there were two state senators, Democrats. It was Liz Kruger and Julia Salazar backing dual bills to reform the illicit trade. And that Kruger's would shield sex workers and only go after Johns. The Nordic model would be put in place. And Salazar would legalize every aspect of the harmful industry. So Salazar wants to go and have complete legalization. Kruger would want to go ahead and do the Nordic model like there is in France. So that was what they wanted to go and try to do and see if they could try to get the pass. But we know right now that there's been quite a market right now as we speak that has been very prominent, and not much has been able to get done so far in New York City because there is the market of sweethearts. Now that's another story in its own. And now it's from New York Post back in February. They talk about how New York City Police was raiding a dozen brothels, a dozen massage parlors. They were allegedly housing backroom bordellos along Queens' Roosevelt Avenue, a notorious red light district exposed in a series of exclusive New York Post reports. And the next day, at least a dozen skin merchants stood outside of storefronts to lure clients. And then, touring Roosevelt Avenue, The New York Post was able to go and see one bold sex worker wearing a furry white jacket and a pink dress, whispering in a reporter's ear, fuck, $100. So that kind of stuff was going on. And, but the thing is that even when it's illegal, there are still some sex workers that are willing to go ahead and do their work and try to get themselves money and make what they can. So Queens, Roosevelt Avenue, if you're looking to go and find out where you want to go for that. But now back to New York State. Advocates demanding crackdown on sex buyers. This is from WENY in New York. And that sex trade survivors and anti-trafficking advocates were looking to make a big change to the state laws dealing with prostitution. So there was a bill being proposed, the Sex Trade Survivors Justice and Equality Act, addressing the issue by ensuring people within prostitution are not prosecuted. Instead, they're supported with comprehensive services such as housing and trauma-informed medical care. The bill would also enact strict penalties for pimps, sex buyers, and traffickers. Again, Nordic model. So I'm guessing, with all the penalties and all the fines and all, they want to go and repurpose that money into comprehensive services, housing and trauma-informed medical care. That's commendable. But, think about if they did legalize it. And think about if they made it to a point where sex work was legalized and taxed upon. And then take that money and push it into these kind of services. I don't know. If there was something where money could be put inside, and this is, again, a real broad conversation here. But I think one of the things that has to be importantly done, if sex work is legalized across the board, if people want to have that, you have to look at, first of all, the welfare of any children that are pulled into this inadvertently and being forced into this. The trafficking cannot happen. So there has to be transparency there. The second part has to be, just like I said here, if there's support here, like with this act, whereby you have comprehensive services like housing and trauma-informed medical care, I support that. Those two areas I would support completely. And if those areas can be supported, then yeah, by all means. Then you have the inroads. If somebody wants to go and get into sex work, look, there's obviously people that don't want to work at all. And you know what? There's not a lot of money, not a lot of money being made on OnlyFans. There's only a certain amount of people that are making money on OnlyFans at all. Some others, if I bet you some of these OnlyFans girls, some of these e-girls, if they knew that prostitution was legal, they probably would go ahead and do it. And if that's the way they choose, that's their choice. Who are we to say anything about it? This is where, you have to consider who wants to go into prostitution in the first place and how they get there. But the most important thing is that, it also comes down to making sure that if you don't want someone to be in the world's oldest profession, that is something to do with parenting and support from home and from family and extended family, especially, that, you have to understand about who gets into this point and how people will go ahead and go into these depths of getting into this kind of work. There's one thing to be considered about that. And it's like, I imagine there are probably some advocates out there that, not only would go ahead and want to be hoping to ensure people within prostitution are prosecuted, but also want to go ahead and help those that, offer safety and offer guidance in any kind of support they can get. And those kind of things happening as well. Washington, D.C., there's a story from the Washington Blade that talks about that. They're advocating for the fact that D.C. should legalize sex work. Yes, the nation's capital. They should legalize sex work as soon as possible. Now, in this story, this is from the America's LGBTQ source. And they give a historical account here saying that sex work is an unfortunate yet constant part of society. Sex work dates back to 2400 BCE. And when Sumerian records indicate that prostitution happened in temple brothels. Across the world now, there are brothels in most countries. Some are regulated by government, most others not. Sex work will always be a part of society, mostly used by men, although in instances like in Amsterdam, women were able to solicit sex from traditionally identified men for a while. So in the U.S., we know that certain states have already legalized sex work. One state specifically is Nevada. And only 6 counties have legal brothels in Nevada. That's what we have so far. Now, there are some other places they refer to here. Paid sex places like the Florida Keys and D.C. residents have found themselves finding a happy ending in massage parlors across the metropolitan areas and in strip clubs as well. Long story short, people, men and women of every gender in between, will always desire sex, paid or unpaid. Because we are all a little depraved and debaucherous. Remember that. Sex will always be desired. Prostitution will always be abound on American streets, be they legal or illegal. So the only rational decision is to make the lives of sex workers safer and more regulated. Agreed, but I think those other parameters have to be considered. I mean, it just can't be just a full blanket legalization, the full blanket, decriminalizing. As long as there are opportunities to be made that sex workers can, they're safer and more regulated. And for those, if they feel like this is a choice they have to make, or they want to make, and they are committed to this, again, a woman's choice, right? Now, there's more to this that they're going to be talking about here in this story, because they mention themselves as being a queer outlet, that, they also feel like trans women and trans women of color rely on prostitution to pay their bills to get by in life. And they resort to it because they can't find a regular white or blue-collar job to sustain finances. It's a very sad one indeed, and depressing to think about. And society's messed up, and it's messed up in more ways than one. Now, I won't speak anything to, for people that are not straight, okay? That's not my department. I think for the most part, when I do talk about various issues when it comes to being depraved and debaucherous, I like to keep it where, it applies to your traditional, what history has taught us and what things are like today, just between men and women. But to be honest, as I always say, there are obviously points where you can apply the same kind of concepts of being depraved and debaucherous by those that are being dominant and those that are being submissive. I think you could do it the same way. And, whichever side or whichever gender or whichever fluidity that you are, somebody's going to be dominant, somebody's going to be submissive. So it still applies in some way, shape, or form. Just think about that. Now, one of the stories I got to make mention of that I also saw the same kind of information coming from. Interesting story. We talked about in San Diego, and I think it was in Los Angeles, that they have various areas where prostitution has been rampant, and it just kind of goes along. So, yeah, there's that too. Well, San Diego, California, there's now a prostitution surveillance tower. Warrantless surveillance, Comic Con sex trafficking, and the persistence of trafficking myths. So, a story from Reason magazine. They decided now there's a creepy surveillance tower under the auspice of stopping sex sellers and sex buyers from meeting. The prostitution surveillance tower, which is stationed along National City's Roosevelt Avenue, records a video of anyone who happens to be in the area. Normalizing warrantless surveillance. Now, this is the part that is being made most important, which I think, this is not the way we want to go ahead and people being looked at and being monitored. A supporter of the surveillance tower told the local CBS affiliate that it would help reduce prostitution by recording the license plate numbers of people who enter the area to pick up sex workers. Listen, you catch them in the act. You're there. You want to go do a sting, that's another thing. But this right here, invading privacy like that is an issue. So schemes to catch people who want to pay for a consenting adult for sex are a waste of money and manpower and a violation of privacy, free association, and bodily autonomy. And of course, I agree on all that. But if you even think that punishing prostitution customers or sex workers themselves is a swell idea, it's hard to see how the surveillance tower makes any sense. Agreed again. So this person who's writing this is, I'm agreeing with a lot of what they're saying here. You can't charge someone for simply picking up another person off the street, even if the person thinks the person on the street looks like a sex worker. Even if money visibly exchanged hands, it's not a crime to give someone cash, unless the entire sexual exchange happens right in front of the cameras. it's hard to imagine on what basis cops could possibly make any charges stick. So the tower is very visible. Local media have been trying to publicize it. Smart sex workers and their customers simply move to another area, less visible. If the surveillance tower has any impact at all, it will just drive prostitution from one part of the city to the other. That's it. Agreed. Yeah, this is not a smart idea. Who's the idiot that thought this was an idea to do this in San Diego? So you're calling it the prostitution surveillance tower, which means, okay, San Diego, we have prostitution. So it's not there. Maybe it's somewhere nearby. Or maybe you can find out where it is, because people could talk about that story and say, you know what? Go talk to your local taxi drivers, your transportation workers, your people on the street, even the homeless person. They probably know where it is. Panhandler. They probably just throw like a bucket or whatever in their cup, and you can just tell them, hey, where's that? Where's the action? And they'll probably tell you. They'll probably know. It seems clear here that it isn't the crackdown on prostitution, just a way for authorities to look like they're doing something about sex trafficking while further normalizing the idea of conducting broad, warrantless surveillance of everyone. Now, San Diego County, they're trying to go and put some story out there. There's a group called The Ugly Truth that say that there are 3,000 to 8,000 sex trafficking victims in the county each year. But they can't base on any particular study or facts where they have it. The website doesn't say anything about how they got those numbers. But according to the Reason magazine, they're saying that actually that number they're citing, 3,000 to 8,000 sex trafficking victims in the county each year, is even more than what the whole country sees in a whole year. And they also mentioned the fact that there are constantly sex trafficking stings in California and elsewhere that routinely turn up few or no victims. So that is bogus if it exists at all. They say there are approximately 18,000 victims in the U.S. But if you took that idea and tried to calculate it, that would count to between 17 and 44% of all U.S. trafficking victims are in San Diego County. They also try to say that the average age of sex trafficking is 16 years old, and that prostitution is an $800 million industry locally. Man, if people knew they could make $800 million in that industry, that's like about bigger than what cannabis is. So then, yeah, if that, I bet you I know some people that, Colombian cartels and Chinese folks, that want to go and bring people over. Trust me, if San Diego County is making $800 million locally on prostitution, then let me tell you, there will be a slew of strip clubs and brothels and massage parlors. A whole lot of that going on. Trust me, that's just not... There will be a windfall if people knew there was that kind of money going on, okay? You would see more brothels, you would see more massage parlors, and you would see liquor stores and cannabis dispensaries. I guarantee you that. So of all these ideas, what do we like of any of them, huh? Do we like the Nordic model where people are kind of moving along and trying to find their way to, find, that the Johns and the pimps need to be charged? Is that a better choice? Do we think that, decriminalizing altogether is going to take care of everything and always solve the problem? Do we think that having a prostitution surveillance tower is going to fix anything? No. But I think there's one thing you can do. You know what it is? You can let them be a little depraved and debaucherous.